I currently live in a very old town. The town is out in the middle of nowhere and only has a few thousand people. However, during the summer, we do get a good amount of tourists coming by our town, mainly because of our gas stations that are so close to the highway. To me, it seems a bit sad that the nicest thing that my town offers is our gas stations. I am currently living on the outskirts of this town, just off of a dirt road that no one goes on. The dirt road is shared by me and an old woman that I refer to as Grandma Dixie. Grandma Dixie's husband passed away a few years ago, due to old age. Because of this, she now lives alone in her house. Grandma Dixie is a good family friend of ours. I make sure to stop by at least twice a day just to make sure that she's okay. Dixie is pretty old, but her house is much older. It has gotten to the point to where it might actually be a safety concern to live in that house. I've tried a couple of times to try to get her to come live with me, but her house just has too many items and too many memories for her just to leave that all behind. One of the biggest frustrations with that house is her back door. The back door's latch is broken, so the back door will never stay shut. I made sure to prop up a cinder block against the door to keep it shut, but sometimes Dixie will take the cinder block to use it as a step stool and forgets to put it back. The dirt road that we live on is surrounded by trees. During the nighttime, it does get quite spooky. It gets extremely difficult to see. This is mainly due to the density of the trees, not allowing any light to pass through. There's also a phenomenon that I often refer to as night sounds. I am aware that there are a lot of nocturnal animals that live in these woods, but some of the sounds that we hear are very supernatural. On some nights, you will hear crying or weeping coming from deep inside the woods. On more startling nights, you can hear what sound like screams just coming from outside my house. I've asked Dixie about the sounds and if she's ever heard them. She always tells me that it's never good to talk about it, and she never tells me why. This makes me curious, but not to the point to where I actually investigate, but I always have it in the back of my mind. I remember one evening I went over to Grandma Dixie's house. It was the evening and we watched Jeopardy, during which Grandma Dixie loves her wine, so by the time of Double Jeopardy comes around, she's pretty tipsy. I decided that this night would be a perfect night to ask her about the screaming out in the woods. Instead of her normally pushing it off, she actually opened up about what was actually happening. She told me about the woods being cursed by these creatures, but she didn't name them. She seemed too afraid, which was very unlike her. She then gave me a brief history of the town, which was unjustifiably taken by force from the natives. What she was saying actually made sense to me. It made sense why the town was so small, and that no one really wanted to stay for too long. She then went into detail a little bit more about the creatures, how that they were able to mimic sounds and lure people out in the woods. I began to get uneasy at this topic. It was getting late, and I still had to walk back home. I double-checked Dixie's house and made sure all the doors and windows were closed. I double-checked that back door and made sure that the cinder block was securely in place. As I made my way outside, I instantly felt eyes on me. As if somehow I alerted every predator to my location. I quickly walked down the dirt road, while seemingly noticing every noise and every movement. It's not like I haven't done this a million times before. It was just different, and I really can't explain why. My house was now within eyesight when I heard a weird sound coming from the woods. It was like a low growl that slowly transformed into something more familiar. The sound was coming from behind me, somewhat close to Dixie's house. For a very brief moment, I thought it was Dixie trying to call me back, as if I forgot something at her house, which has actually happened before. But when I turned around, I finally realized that the sound was actually coming from deep inside the woods, nowhere near where Dixie would be. The sounds were very familiar and sounded like Dixie, but again, the sounds were deep in the woods, nowhere near where she would actually be at this time of night. I turned back around and I sprinted towards my house. Whatever it was making those sounds stopped, and I began to hear movement coming from behind me. It sounded like something very big moving through the woods at a very fast pace. Whatever the thing was, it was definitely gaining on me. But thankfully, I had a head start. I was able to reach my house and open and close my door before whatever it was reached me. Once the door closed behind me, I heard a loud thud and scratching, as if it was a very large dog trying to get in. The scratching quickly stopped, and I was met with silence. That's when I heard whatever it was begin to mimic Dixie again. It was very convincing. If I'd not just been chased by this creature, I would have probably opened the door and would have gotten mauled by this thing. I tried peering outside, but I didn't see anything. Whatever this thing was, it was smart to stay out of my line of sight. I went around my house, making sure all my doors and windows were securely locked. I then placed my trusty shotgun next to my bed, just in case I had any nightly visitors. The night was uneventful. Despite being chased through the woods, I didn't have anything else strange happen to me that evening. I got up early the next morning. For some reason, I had forgotten what had happened the night before. I got up and made breakfast. As I was leaving my house for work, I noticed that my front door had huge scratches on the front of it, and then the memories of the night before came flooding back to me. I then hopped in my car and made my way off to work. While driving on the dirt road, I passed Dixie's house. I did a quick glance over, as I normally did, and to my surprise, the front door was hanging on its hinges, as if something broke into the house. I immediately pulled over into her driveway. I walked up to the front of the house, stopping on the front porch. I peered into the house as best I could, while calling her name. The inside of the house was quite dark, but I could still see that the furniture was flipped over. Something definitely went down last night. I was just about to step into the house when I heard something calling my name from the inside. It sounded much like Dixie, except her voice was very staticky and hoarse, as if she was at a concert screaming her lungs out the night before, but obviously that wasn't the case. I yelled back into the dark house, "Hey Dixie, you okay?" There was a very long pause. She finally responded with a very calm yes, and then she invited me inside. Something was off. I politely declined her invitation, and I told her that I had to get to work, which was actually true. Something told me inside my gut that whatever it was talking to me wasn't Dixie. I got out of there as quickly as I could, without raising any suspicions. Once I was in town, I called the police telling them what I had experienced. They seemed almost uninterested, thinking that it was probably a prank. I then drove to work starting my long shift. About an hour into my shift, I got a phone call back from the police, telling me that they had responded to my call and they had a couple questions for me. I told my boss that the police needed me, and I drove down to the police station. Once I was at the station, the police would begin to question me for the next 2 hours. Due to the severity of the tone and the types of questions, I was able to deduce that Dixie was now missing, if not worse. Right before I left the police station, the police told me what they thought had happened. They thought that the back door of Dixie's house was left open, and that a wolf or a bobcat had gotten in. Due to the blood at the scene, they thought that Dixie was most likely gone, but they never found a body, which I think is kinda strange. However, I didn't tell the police about my experience with that thing chasing me in the woods. Due to the investigation taking place on my dirt road, the police offered to put me in a motel for the meantime. I obviously declined, and I drove back later that night once my shift was done. By that time the police had left, but there was still caution tape all around her house. I slowed my car just a bit as I was peering inside, but I never did stop. Whatever had happened at Dixie's house had freaked me out, and I decided to put my house up for sale. But whatever it was that happened at Dixie's house must have gotten around town, because I got no offers on my house. Unfortunately, I still live in that house today, and every time I drive by Dixie's house, I can't help but think, what actually happened that night? The year was 1982. My family thought it would be fun to rent out our RV and go cross-country driving across the United States. We started our trip in Washington, considering that we lived there, and we wanted to end up in Florida, spend a week there, and drive back. We weren't even halfway through our trip when our RV decided to go out in Wyoming. If you know anything about Wyoming, there's not very much there. Our RV decided to die on the most desolate highway I'd ever seen. Nothing but flat land all around, not a car in sight. There was, however, an old barn a couple miles back. I only remember this because it had one of those silos that looked like you could push it over at any moment. Surely someone had to live there. My mom stayed behind with everyone in the RV, and my dad and I went walking back to the barn. About 3 hours later, we made it to the barn. It turns out the barn was just an empty shell, and no one lived there. We did, however, find a telephone, but it was obviously disconnected. My dad and I began our long walk back, and it started to get dark. We saw 2 cars on our way back, and obviously, they didn't stop for us. At this point, it was pretty dark outside. We had another hour or so to walk before we'd be back at our RV. While we were walking, I started to hear what sounded like howling coming from behind us. Not your typical coyote or wolf howling, but something much bigger. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The howling almost seemed supernatural, as if it could not have come from an animal. My dad and I began to pick up our pace. As we did this, the howling that was behind us got louder. I would glance back every couple hundred yards. The curiosity was burning inside my mind. We finally made it back to our RV, and oddly enough, one of the cars that passed us stopped for the RV and gave my mom a ride into town. It turns out the RV just had a dead battery, which she was able to purchase in town. The guy that sold her the battery was able to come out and help install it for her, all in the time that it took us to get down to the barn and back. My dad and I quickly and gratefully jumped into the RV and took off down the road, back the way we were walking. While my mother was explaining how she was able to save the RV and the day, the lights of the RV came across this ungodly creature in the middle of the road. Whatever it was very fast, but I was able to make out what it looked like. It was very tall and very lanky. The fur looked very dirty and matted, as if it was in the desert for quite some time. The creature had the head and teeth of what looked like a large German shepherd that was snarling at us. But the most disturbing feature, and the one I haven't forgotten, was its hands. The creature had human hands. Everyone inside the RV saw the creature and let out terrified screams. My dad tore off down the highway, nearly missing the beast. The next half hour was filled with crying and tears, while my parents tried to calm us down, but to no avail. Right then and there, my family decided unanimously to cut the trip short. I still think about that night from time to time, whenever I'm driving on a lone highway, and I often think how lucky my dad and I were, that not only that the creature didn't get us, but that my mom was able to get the RV fixed while we were away. I can't imagine staying the night in the middle of that road, with that creature just outside. My family owns a farm that's very big, that's out in the middle of nowhere. My family farms mostly wheat and corn, but we also have a couple cattle on the property. Every November, my farm experiences a very strange phenomenon in which many cattle go missing. We are concerned about this, for obvious reasons, but even more so for our geological location. There shouldn't be any natural predators that would kill our cattle. There aren't any bears, wolves, bobcats, even coyotes in our area. So, what's killing our cattle? One November, we decided to host a hunting party on our property to see what was killing our animals. Our hunting party set up base near the cattle pen. The cattle pen is set up next to the woods, which is overgrown with brush and trees. My family figured that the 8-foot barbed wire fence would be enough to keep animals out of the cattle pen. But obviously, this wasn't true. During the first couple of nights, the hunting party claimed that they heard strange sounds coming from the woods. Now when I say strange, I mean sounds that don't normally come from the woods. Sounds that sound like screaming and crying, that sound as if they come from people. This is obviously disturbing, since we don't live near anyone. During the day, the hunting party would go investigate in the woods. They would find signs of something very large moving in the brush. There would be brush cleared, as well as bark removed from trees. My first thought of this was that it was either a deer or a large elk. Then we started to see paw prints, as if it was a very large wolf. But like I said earlier, wolves do not live in this part of the country, and in fact, I don't think I've ever seen one here. That doesn't mean though that one wolf couldn't have accidentally migrated down by itself. But then again, wolves typically do not remove bark from trees for no reason. We then continued the hunting party during the nighttime. Although the cattle would not be removed from the pen, the screaming and shouting coming from the woods would continue louder and louder. Someone recommended that during the night that we investigate the screaming and shouting inside the woods. Myself and 4 other people went inside the woods during the nighttime. Instead of screaming, the 5 of us began to hear whispering coming from deep inside the woods. All of us were spooked by this. 2 of the people inside of our hunting group decided to leave immediately. This was actually a smart decision that I wish I followed. Me and the 2 other people decided to investigate the whispering. We decided to turn off our flashlights so it wouldn't give away our position. We immediately realized that our visibility was greatly diminished, so we turned them back on. When I turned my light back on, my flashlight flashed across something that was deep in the woods. Whatever it was very big, and it walked on two legs. I kept my flashlight pointed at the tree that it was behind, and I told the other two guys that I saw a bear behind the tree. The tree was about 30 yards away, and we slowly made our way towards it. About halfway there, we started to hear shots coming from back at the farm. We immediately turned around and sprinted back. The shots were coming from the two other guys, saying that they saw something in the woods, on the other side of the farm. That's when I noticed that we were missing someone in our hunting party. One of the two people I was with in the woods didn't make it out. We immediately turned around and looked for him in the woods, but we didn't find anything. We even tried calling his phone out of desperation. Oddly enough, something or someone answered the phone, but didn't ever speak, but I could hear breathing. The next morning we decided to report it to the police station. They came out for an hour or two, did a quick investigation out in the woods, and asked us a couple of questions. I could tell that both of the police officers seemed very spooked to be out on the farm. They kept scanning the tree line, as if they were expecting something to come out. I also told the policeman that I thought that the thing might have been a bear. They asked me why I thought that, and I told them what I saw last night. They then asked me, "Did it try to speak to you?" I slowly nodded. The policemen then looked at each other and got in their car immediately. Before they took off down the road, they said something to me that stuck to me to this day. They said, "Whatever this thing is, just give it what it wants." I don't know what to make of this situation. It's quite clear that whatever this thing is, the police are aware of it. Obviously, I never heard back from the police, and I never saw signs of my one friend ever again. Every November since, instead of setting up a hunting party, we decided to leave out one cow for whatever it was that took my friend. Ever since we started doing this, we haven't had problems since. When I was younger, I used to work for a plumbing company down in Arizona. I got calls all over the city, and I would travel in my company van. We sometimes got calls from the Navajo reservation, which we weren't actually allowed to visit. I don't know why. I asked my boss about this a couple times, and he always gave me random answers. The main answer that I would always get was that our car insurance wouldn't be covered out there if anything happened. I did drive a rather big van that had lots of equipment in it, so I guess it kinda made sense. I was finally able to get a direct answer from my boss one night. When I was over at his place and we were drinking beers, I then asked him the same question I've always been asking. He was pretty drunk and pretty open about talking about anything, so he told me this story. About 15 years ago, before he was the boss, he was actually a plumber for the company. The company's policy back then was pretty flexible, so he would take a couple contracts down on the reservations. One day on the reservation, he took a contract with a man that claimed to be a very dark magic man. My boss at the time didn't really care what this meant, he just wanted to get paid. The dark magic man was quite old. His English was quite poor as well, which made talking quite difficult. He got a call from him one day saying that there was something in his basement that he needed to fix. Upon arriving, he realized that the man wasn't actually at the house, but there was a note on the door. The note read, in very poor English, "Leak in basement. Don't look around." My boss was a little bit weirded out by this, but he figured that he was already here and he'd driven all this way. He entered the home and made his way into the basement. The basement was naturally unfinished, adding to the creep factor. Before he reached the bottom, he was able to hear a drip coming from inside the basement, which made finding the leaky pipe quite easy. He walked up to the pipe and began working. While he was working, he began to hear sounds coming from inside the basement. It sounded like something wooden being scratched. At first he thought it was just a pet, maybe a dog. He paid it no mind and continued working. While he was working, he heard the scratching again. This time he heard a small voice coming from behind a wooden door, asking for help. He found the door in the corner of the room that was heavily bolted shut. The door was made out of wood, but had 3 padlocks on it. At first my boss thought maybe he came across a child trafficker, or a kidnapper of some kind. The voice coming from behind the door seemed young and feminine. My boss got up quickly and ran to the door, asking if the child was okay. The child said that she was trapped behind the door, and that the man in the house was keeping her there forever. My boss did all he could to try to open the door, but to no avail. He then looked around the basement, looking for any set of keys that could maybe go to the door. To his surprise, he found a set of keys that looked like they belonged to the door. He tried the keys on the lock, and sure enough, they worked. Quick note, my boss's name is Steve. Steve was unlocking the last lock on the door when the voice behind the door said, "Thank you, Steve." The voice was still feminine and young, but it seemed off. How did the little girl know his name? He stopped unlocking the door and took a step back. Something was way off. Steve then decided to look under the door, something that he says that he regrets doing. He says what he saw on the other side of the door was evil incarnated. He only looked briefly, but what he saw was disturbing. Standing by the door on the other side was a huge creature. The creature's feet were huge claws. Once he saw this, the creature began to scream and shake the door violently. Steve thought that the door was going to break down. He turned around immediately, running up the stairs, leaving his tools behind. Before he reached the top of the stairs, the door holding the creature back broke down. The creature was now free. Steve was able to get out of the basement and the house safely. He got in his van and drove off. He told me that that was the scariest event that he'd ever been through, and that if the creature actually caught him, he probably would have been dead. So that's the actual reason why we're not allowed on the reservation. When I was younger, there was a place that my friends and I would go to when we'd want to do drugs. We referred to it as the shack. The shack was out in a field, and to get to it, you'd have to do a 2-mile hike through the woods. We only knew about the shack because we got lost once in the woods. The shack was perfect. It was nowhere near civilization or any roads. We could be as loud as we wanted, and no one would find us. One time while we were walking out to the shack, we saw a man standing out in the middle of the woods. The man was shirtless and didn't have shoes on. He was very pale and pasty. He almost looked like an alien. We noticed that his joints looked swollen and kind of bent at weird angles. We figured that he was also in the woods to do drugs, so we just let him be. He didn't seem to notice us, and we continued out to the shack. On the way to the shack, we talked about the guy and how he kind of freaked us out. One of my friends in the group asked, "What if he finds our shack?" We all tell him that it's near impossible, since the man didn't see us and he would have no idea where to go. This seems to calm everyone down, and we continue to the shack. Once there, we do our nefarious activities, and we completely forget about the man in the woods. It's starting to get late and we decide to head back. We open the door to the shack, and to our surprise, we see the shirtless man about 100 yards ahead of us. He seems to be walking on all fours, sniffing the ground. All of us freeze when we see him, and at that very moment, he turns and looks at us. When he sees us, he stands up very slowly and tries his best to act natural. He then walks towards us in the most peculiar way, as if he's part zombie. Instead of waiting to see what happens next, all of us take off in the woods. Some of us get separated from the group and have to find their way back on their own. Thankfully, I'm stuck with 2 other friends as we're running back through the woods. My friends and I decide to stop for a quick break in order to catch our breath. As we're resting, we see one of our friends running by himself through the woods. We make sure to flag him down so that he sees us and that he rests with us. The friend that we see is named Kyle, and we ask if he saw anyone else, to which he shakes his head. We then ask him if he knows where the creepy man was, and he also shakes his head. I figure that he's still high from our earlier smoke sesh, and I don't think twice about his behavior. After a couple of minutes and that we're finally rested, I then recommend that we get going, so that the man doesn't find us. After 30 minutes of running through the woods, we finally make it to our parked car. To my complete and utter surprise, my other friends, including Kyle, are already in the car. Myself and my 2 friends that I was with were completely stunned. "How did Kyle beat us here?" I asked. One of my 2 friends said that he was just behind him right before we found the car. We book it inside the car, not telling anyone what we saw, until after we got back. Once we told everyone what we saw, everyone else thought we were still high. Even if we were all still high, how come we all saw the same thing? The event itself with the man freaked us out enough to where we actually never went back to the shack. But even then, that event with Kyle still freaked me out. I'm just glad that I was never fully alone with Kyle in the woods.